Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union from 1920 until his death in 1953. To this day, he remains to be one of the most consequential and controversial leaders of all time. When Stalin came to power, Russia was a largely rural society, lagging significantly behind the West in heavy industry, food production, and arms manufacturing. The entire country was in serious jeopardy, and the threat of invasion loomed over. However, Stalin had ambitious plans in mind that would revolutionize the country and transform it into a great superpower. In a series of 5-year plans, beginning in 1928, the production of heavy industry products like coal, iron, and steel skyrocketed. Unemployment rates decreased rapidly, and a new workforce emerged. The country produced tanks, aircrafts, and artillery at a huge scale to supply its army. Massive literacy campaigns produced a highly educated workforce and reduced illiteracy dramatically. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had become one of the world's leading industrial economies. Joseph Stalin transformed Russia from a backwater agrarian nation into a powerful empire capable of rivaling the West and destroying the German war machine in World War II. Nevertheless, Stalin's greatest achievements and gravest mistakes are inseparably intertwined, because for every industrial milestone achieved, there was always a human cost too tremendous to ignore. In this video, we will look at Stalin's greatest mistakes that not only shaped the Soviet Union, but changed the course of world history. Stay with me, and let's explore one of history's most extraordinary and controversial leaders. In the year 1928, Joseph Stalin started enacting the first of a series of 5-year plans, which called for a strict focus on rapid industrialization and food production. As the expanding Red Army and urban population grew, Stalin had to find a way to feed them in order to secure his power. So he implemented a policy which was nothing short of extreme. All privately owned land was confiscated, and collective farms were instituted to be run by the state. Stalin's logic was that it would be far easier to take grain from a few collective farms than from 25 million households. In turn, the government would be able to feed the growing population and sell the grain abroad to finance Stalin's ambitious plans for industrialization. However, this policy was met with fierce resistance from the peasantry, who refused to hand over their farms and crops and chose to slaughter their livestock instead. Stalin responded by launching a deadly campaign against the kulaks, a class of relatively wealthy peasants who owned their own private lands. This campaign involved the mass arrests, deportations, and executions of Russia's most experienced and productive farmers. By eliminating them, the state crushed widespread rebellion and set an example for any future opposition. Stalin also ordered a violent campaign of forced collectivization, where the secret police and party activists were sent to the countryside to force peasants off their land and to take their crops. Unfortunately, the situation often went too far, and the requisitioning committee took everything away from the farmers in order to meet unrealistic quotas. They even searched high and low for any hidden crops and seized all available grain on site, and so many peasants were left with nothing to eat or feed their families. The result, of course, was catastrophic, leading to the man-made famine of 1932 to 1933. There was widespread disease, lawlessness, and even cannibalism in the Russian provinces. The famine severely impacted places like Ukraine, South Russia, the North Caucasus, and Kazakhstan. As starvation intensified, desperate peasants tried to flee from such regions in search of food. Then, Stalin ordered the borders to be sealed, preventing the starving population from leaving. Those who tried to flee were shot dead before they could ever escape. This action effectively turned these territories into massive death traps, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 5 to 7 million people. In August 1932, Stalin passed a law that made stealing even a handful of grain from a collective farm an act punishable by imprisonment and death. Thousands of men, women and children were sent to prison and executed for stealing socialist property when in fact they were only trying to survive. Furthermore, entire villages and districts that failed to meet grain quotas were placed on blacklists and surrounded by troops to be cut off from the outside world. All goods were confiscated and inhabitants were condemned to death by starvation. The greatest irony of all of this is that Stalin's extreme policy fueled the Russian industry as deported farmers offered a new workforce in factories, and then production output increased considerably. The grain that was sold abroad propelled the economy and made it possible to obtain advanced technologies from the West. Nevertheless, the price of Stalin's achievements was disastrous, as millions of people lost their livelihood, lived in hunger and fear, and were eventually exterminated by starvation. By the late 1930s, the Soviet people were unhappy with Stalin's policies and the destructive results they caused. Although Stalin held considerable power, this was a huge concern for him as a leader. The possibility of bitter discontent bursting into open rebellion was unacceptable to him, and Stalin wanted to prevent this from ever happening. Sadly, he went about it the wrong way and took it too far as usual. By early 1937, the Soviet Union was engulfed in terror that infiltrated every level of its society. Anyone who was even suspected of disapproving of Stalin's regime, or worse yet, plotting against him, was a victim. It was sufficient if someone told a joke or denounced another person to be taken into custody and interrogated. Many victims were even tortured to confess crimes they'd never committed and were ultimately arrested. Millions of citizens were incarcerated, sent to labor camps, or even shot with no substantial evidence. Stalin's paranoia festered into the highest levels of government, spreading through his own Communist Party. He saw potential enemies, counter-revolutionaries, and conspiracies everywhere around him. Prominent Bolsheviks like Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin were put on show trials and confessed under torture to spurious crimes of espionage. All of them were put to death by firing squad. Fearing a challenge to his power from the army, Stalin purged the military of tens of thousands of its officers, marshals and commanders, rendering the army critically weakened on the eve of World War II. The list of people condemned by this mass purge goes on and on. Kulaks, priests, Germans, Latvians, Poles, Harbonites, and Jews were among many who were sought after, captured and killed. Even professors, artists and intellectuals who opposed Stalin were exterminated. Stalin clearly saw ethnic minorities and political dissidents as internal enemies aligned with foreign powers, and they had to be dealt with. After their arrest and interrogation, victims were usually shipped off in cattle trucks to the Gulag, where prisoners were put to work like slaves under inhuman conditions. Many of them were sent to inhospitable places where they mined gold and felled timber in freezing temperatures. They were subjected to sleep deprivation, beatings, and torture. If a prisoner could not meet their shift quota, they were not given full food rations and had to work the next shift. They were constantly kept hungry, malnourished, and overworked. If a prisoner died, they were expendable and replaced with another. The Kolyma Highway, which was built by prisoners, became known as the Road of Bones because of the dead bodies buried underneath it. During Stalin's rule, over 15 million slaves were sent to the Gulag to build canals, railroads, factories, and power plants. They also excavated mines, harvested timber, and worked in factories. By 1953, over 1.5 million people died from the grueling conditions of the Gulag, while roughly 750,000 were executed during the Great Purge alone. Undoubtedly, the Gulag system served as a great economic purpose in the rapid industrialization and infrastructure development Stalin had achieved during his reign. However, the massive number of deaths resulting from it was utterly wasteful of human resources. This clearly shows Stalin's ruthlessness in achieving his ambitions, even at the cost of millions of lives. By late 1938, the Great Terror had provoked so much hysteria, violence and chaos that threatened to destabilize the government. This led Stalin to wind it down and arrest its key political leader, Nikolai Yezhov, head of the NKVD. However, the system of repression and the Gulag itself endured until Stalin's death in 1953. This period of Great Terror not only eliminated a generation of political, military, and intellectual people, but also left a deep and lasting scar in Russian history. In the year 1940, the German army had conquered much of Europe. Hitler's advance was rapid, ruthless, and steadfast, and after the fall of France, he was at the height of his power. Watch our latest video to learn more about Hitler's conquest and deadly mistakes. Hitler was a fierce ideological enemy of Stalin. He saw communism as part of a Jewish conspiracy that threatened to destroy Germany and Western civilization. In August 1939, Stalin shocked the world and signed the non-aggression pact with Hitler. It was hard to believe that these two ideological enemies could find common cause. However, Hitler and Stalin were not complete idealists. They were also realists. This agreement bought Stalin time to reorganize and strengthen his army after purging it of thousands of its troops, while it gave Hitler the freedom to conquer Poland and carve it up with the Soviet Union. A week later, the German army invaded Poland, which led Britain and France to declare war on Germany, effectively starting World War II. As Hitler continued his conquest in Europe, Stalin received intelligence that Hitler was sure to abandon the pact and attack the Soviet Union. However, Stalin deeply mistrusted intelligence reports by their very nature. He possibly persuaded himself that Hitler was locked in battle with the British Empire and that he simply would not be mad enough to attack the Soviet Union, another major power. However, Stalin was gravely mistaken in underestimating Hitler's appetite for conquest. On June 22, 1941, 3 million German soldiers with 7,000 field guns and over 3,000 tanks lined up along the Soviet border, ready to invade. Countless reports from spies, ambassadors, and deserters warned Stalin that an attack was imminent, but he still couldn't believe it. Stalin and the Red Army were caught completely off guard. Most of the troops on the Western Front, especially in Belarus, had not been put on alert, and so Hitler attacked the Soviet Union with virtually no resistance. His attack was sharp, effective, and deadly. The Soviets incurred heavy losses at the start of the invasion, losing more than 1,000 airplanes on day one and millions of Soviet soldiers thereafter. Hitler's army made swift progress through Russia until it reached the gates of Moscow. At that point, Stalin was in turmoil and retreated into his dacha on the outskirts of Moscow. The whole country seemed powerless and leaderless in the face of the invasion. It took Stalin some time to regain his composure, but after that, Stalin demonstrated his strong leadership and absolute ruthlessness in winning the war. He rallied the whole country behind him and effectively repelled the German invasion in a series of counterattacks, thereby ending the Second World War in consort with the Allies. On May 2, 1945, the Soviet red flag was raised over the city of Berlin and World War II was over. Stalin was a revolutionary leader who transformed the Soviet Union and made it into a global superpower, but unfortunately, he did so at a devastating cost. His brutal policy of forced collectivization starved his people to death. His paranoia of perceived enemies engulfed the state in terror, and his error of judgment in intercepting Hitler's attack led to unimaginable suffering and millions of deaths. His mistakes weren't just missteps, they were tragedies born of paranoia, ideology, and unchecked power. Therefore, I'd like to ask you, what should Stalin have done differently to avoid these outcomes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have found this video insightful, like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more intriguing videos on history's greatest blunders. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.